Hello everyone. Today I want to discuss a game played between Rene Letelier and Bobby Fischer. This was played in the Leipzig Olympiad in 1960, and this game has been featured in Bobby Fischer's wonderful book, My 60 Memorable Games. Let's check it out. It's one of my favorite games. It starts with d4, knight f6, c4, and g6. So the King's Indian is going to be on the board after knight c3 and bishop g7. And white goes for e4, very standard. And black simply castles, does not go for the d6 line. And he allows white to push e5, which white does. Although this overextends the center to some extent, and it will be incumbent on white to hold on to the center, and black will try to undermine the center. And we'll see how Fischer achieves this very shortly. So first the knight goes back, knight e8, and f4, just strengthening the e5 pawn. d6, challenging the e5 pawn. This position had occurred before, and Fischer had the black pieces in that game too, and his opponent had gone for knight to f3 in that line. And after d into e5, he captured with the f pawn. While this seems very secure, keeping all the pawns in the center together and keeping a strong center, actually the d4 pawn is quite vulnerable, and then the e5 pawn is also vulnerable. So after d into e5, d into e5 is better, allowing for a queen swap, and the f pawn is not easily a target, and therefore the e5 pawn will be secure. However, after f into e5 was played, we have bishop g4, just pinning the knight and putting pressure on d4, bishop e2, unpinning, and c5. The point is that if white has to capture any of the pawns, the c5 pawn, then all the pawns will be split. So that's not something desirable. So bishop f4 to strengthen the e5 pawn. But yeah, black can capture. And after queen takes d4, black can force a queen trade on his own terms with knight c6, hitting the queen. And after queen d8 and rook d8, black is quite happy. That game went like this. So after d6 in this game, white went for bishop e3, just keeping everything in the center intact, but also this does not develop the kingside pieces. That's something to note. And c5 anyway. This is a pawn sacrifice because after d captures c5, you can't capture back with the d pawn because the queen on d8 is undefended. But that's not a concern at all. Simply knight c6 just developing and putting some pressure on the e5 square. C into d6. Now while white has three moves to castle, develop the kingside knight, the kingside bishop, and then castle, white is grabbing pawns, which is a little greedy, so to say. E takes d6, just capturing back and undermining the center. And knight e4, again, just going after that pawn, committing too much instead of developing. Not the best way to play. And Fischer plays a good move here, just bishop f5, simply. Develops with an attack. The knight has to go somewhere, and given how much white is already committed towards that pawn, it's just probably best to go after the d6 pawn with knight into d6 at this point. And after some exchanges on d6 with the queen, and the queens are swapped, the point is that black can grab the b2 pawn with tempo. The rook only has the d1 square available, rook d1, and the knight comes to b4. There are threats of trapping the rook with bishop c2. The knight is capturing the a2 pawn. So king f2 is forced just to make some room for the rook and knight a2. The bishops can go back. The knight could come to c3. A lot of tactics are threatened, and the a pawn is going to be quite strong. So knight e2 is required just to curtail some, just to develop and curtail some moves for black, and a5. Fischer gave this line in his book, and he said that white would have some drawing chances, but black is better here. However, after bishop f5 was played, white chose for knight g3, which looks reasonable because it hits the bishop and threatens to undo black's pawn structure in front of the king. However, bishop e6 is sufficient. This is enough. You just go back, and there is still some tension in the middle. And also we can see that the bishop on g7 is quite a strong bishop now. If the e5 pawn were to ever move, then b2 is a target. So knight moving from c3 to e4 to g3 is also enhance the potential of that bishop, we can say. Knight f3 developing, and queen c7, just adding more pressure on e5 and also preparing rook to d8, which would look at the queen. A couple of moves are possible here. So there's bishop e2, queen c2, and queen b1. So let's look at them one at a time. So if we go for bishop to e2, then we can capture in the center, and this allows for bishop c5, trapping the rook, but it's okay because after queen a5 check, b4 is forced to save a piece, and after knight into b4, we give up the rook and just capture back with the king. We don't want to move our good bishop from that diagonal. So here white will just castle, getting out of some threats, but we have a very strong e into f4, and that pawn is going to be a bone in white's throat. The knight doesn't have too many squares, it will go to e4, but then bishop f5 hits it again, and we can see how active black's pieces are in this line. The rook on a1 is lost. The knight doesn't on e4. Knight on e4 doesn't have too many squares, so not very strong. The other alternative after queen c5 was queen c2, and this also allows d into e5, but the point was f5, just threatening to mess up the kingside pawn structure in front of black. But we capture with a g pawn, and after the knight captures, we have knight b4 hitting the queen. Once the queen moves, queen b3, let's say, we can simply swap knights, the f5 knight for the b4 knight, and black will probably can play knight f6 as an option here, just developing back the knight which had retreated. Knight g4 is a threat. The pieces are quite active, the bishops are good. White still has to develop the light square bishop and then castle. So let's say something like bishop e2, knight g4 could again delay castling, so the rooks can be placed actively. So this is quite an active line for black. So instead of queen c2, Letelier actually went for queen b1. This does not allow knight b4 to come with tempo, and the idea of f5 is intact. So after Fischer captured an f5, as in the previous line, Fischer played e4, which is not the engine's first recommendation, but it's a very principled move that white's king is in the center. We want to attack it, we want to open line, so let's try to clear the path, and we've also cleared the path of the dark square bishop, just come alive. The queen is also a little more active with the e pawn on e4 instead of e5, and white actually enables it. He goes for f into e5 and allows for the trade of pieces. Now the job for black is going to be much simpler with files open while white's king is in the center. G into f3, I think probably didn't want to capture on the f7 square and allow the f file to open up, and f5 by black. e6 pawn can be captured later, and we're threatening f4, which would fork the bishop and the knight. F4 by white to stop that threat, and simply knight f6, just developing. Again, knight g4 would be a threat, and the rooks can come on the e file. Bishop e2 developing, preparing to castle, but rook f to e8. Now the threat is simple: capture on e6 and put pressure on the e3 bishop. So king f2 defending, and rook into e6. And black has a very clear plan. We will double up on the e file, put pressure, and just go for the attack. Rook e1, trying to add some defense, and rook a e8. Here I think probably Letelier thought that he can just add some defense with bishop to f3 to the e3 bishop, and that should be okay. But there aren't many good moves available. And it's interesting that while the engine was calculating Fischer's move, it was not evaluating the move as strong as it really is. So it calculated rook into e3, which is what Fischer played. And after the exchanging a pair of rooks, the other rook comes down again. And after king into e3, it was looking at queen b6 check, which is not the move at all. the move. Maybe you can pause the video here and try to find the wonderful move, and that move which gives this game its title. So the move is queen into f4 check, a queen for the king. So we end with the queen sacrifice, and here white resigned. Let's look at the obvious. If king into f4, then bishop h6 is checkmate. All the squares are taken by the knights, the pawn, and the bishop, and of course white's own pieces hamper the king's movement. And if we go back, if the king goes back here, then knight g4 check, bishop is pinned, king g2 just defending the bishop, and knight e3 check, getting inside the position, king f2 just defending the bishop, and knight d4 putting more pressure on the bishop. The only way to defend the bishop now is queen h1, but knight g4 again. This forces the king to move, and both the king and the queen cannot continue defending the bishop, and material will be lost after king f1, knight into f3. This is quite strong for black. That's why after queen into f4, white resigned. This is why this game was titled A Queen for the King in Bobby Fischer's book, My 60 Memorable Games. That is one of my favorite games. Fischer shows how important it is to undermine an overextended center and how to do it. And also shows us how dangerous it is to advance pawns without thinking. Well, thank you all for watching. I'll see you soon for the next game.